There is a man sitting in front of a camera, voice breaking, hands shaking slightly, and he says something that should have stopped everything. Thousands, not a handful, not a few isolated incidents buried in sealed court records. Thousands of people inside one of the most powerful industries on this planet who witnessed what was being done to children. And every single one of them chose silence. That man is Corey Feldman. You probably know his face. The Goonies, Stand By Me, The Lost Boys. A kid whose image was plastered on lunchboxes and magazine covers while something deeply criminal was happening behind every single one of those smiling photos.
I'm the bad guy. I'm the victim here. I'm the one who's been abused. I'm the one who's trying to come forward and do something about
30 years. That is how long Corey Feldman has been saying this. 30 years of talk shows, book tours, tearful interviews, sealed police reports, and a documentary he funded himself with money he could not afford to lose. And for 30 years, the industry he was trying to expose responded the same way every single time. They laughed. They dismissed. They called him unstable, attention-seeking, a faded star chasing relevance. They called him everything except the one thing the documented record proves he actually was.
Right.
And then Jim Caviezel, the man who walked away from Hollywood rather than keep quiet, heard what Feldman had been building toward for 3 decades. And what happened next was not a press moment. It was not a prepared statement. It was something far more revealing than either of those things. By the time this video ends, you're going to understand exactly what Caviezel heard, exactly why it broke through his composure, and exactly who both of these men have been pointing it all along. Corey Feldman was 11 years old when the entertainment industry got its hands on him. By the time he was a teenager, he was one of the most photographed child actors in Hollywood history. The red carpets, the magazine covers, the handshakes from studio executives telling him he had a future. Behind every single one of those images, something else was happening. Something that nobody holding a camera or a microphone was willing to discuss. He was not simply being managed. He was being circulated among a network of adult men who held either direct industry power or access to people who did. And those connections did not stop at Hollywood. They extended upward.
circle of older men, and they all had either their own power or connections to great power that surrounded themselves around this group of kids.
Connections to great power, not industry contacts, not talent agents with leverage over casting decisions. Power that existed above the Hollywood food chain entirely. Power whose protection did not come from contracts or agreements. It came from somewhere that makes studio executives look small. For 3 decades, Feldman tried every legitimate channel available to him. Talk shows, published memoirs, police reports submitted with names attached, reports that according to multiple accounts were received and never seriously pursued. He sat across from interviewers who smiled warmly and changed the subject the moment his testimony approached something specific. They called him unstable. They called him attention-seeking. They called him a has-been. Here is what 30 years of consistent, detailed, cross-referenced testimony actually looks like from the outside. It does not look like someone inventing a story. It looks like a man accurately describing a structure so deeply embedded in the cultural and financial architecture of this country that the structure itself became the primary mechanism for discrediting him. Think carefully about that distinction. You do not spend 30 years and the resources of an entire industry discrediting someone who is fabricating things. You discredit someone whose truth is too structurally dangerous to allow into the public conversation. In 2020, after 3 decades of being ignored by every platform he approached, Corey Feldman did something that required a level of commitment that most people cannot fully absorb. He spent $1.3 million of his own money he has said publicly he could not afford to lose, to produce and independently release a documentary called My Truth, The Rape of Two Coreys. He named names: Marty Weiss, John Graham, Alfie Hoffman, Dominic Brassi, Charlie Sheen. These were not impulsive accusations. These were names Feldman had already submitted to law enforcement years earlier in a sealed police report that, by multiple accounts, was never meaningfully followed up on. He named them anyway, on camera, to the world. The industry's response was not legal action, not defamation suits, not public demands for accountability from any of the organizations that had the standing and the resources to pursue them. Silence. The same organized, maintained, purchased silence that had followed Feldman for 30 years. And then on the night of the documentary's premiere, the streaming platform carrying it crashed. 15 minutes in. Whether that was coordinated interference or technical failure from overwhelming demand, no satisfying explanation has ever been offered. What everyone who is watching agrees on is the timing. A man who spent 30 years and $1.3 million trying to be heard, silenced again in real time, 15 minutes into finally being heard. But the names Feldman named did not disappear. They surfaced again in completely separate, independently conducted investigations. Marty Weiss, whom Feldman had named in the context of his own abuse, appeared again in Quiet on Set, the documentary examining what happened to children at Nickelodeon during the same era. Same individual, different decade, different victims. Same network. That is not coincidence. That is architecture. Most people know Jim Caviezel as an actor. The man Mel Gibson cast as Jesus Christ in one of the highest-grossing independent films ever produced. The man who had a clear path to the top of Hollywood and watched it close behind him the moment he refused to stay quiet. That is about a quarter of who he actually is in this conversation. For the better part of a decade, Caviezel has been embedding himself inside the fight against child trafficking with the focus of someone who has seen what these networks do to children and cannot make himself look away. He starred in Sound of Freedom, a film built around the documented story of Tim Ballard, a former Homeland Security agent who left his government career to run operations rescuing children from trafficking networks across Latin America. That film, about rescuing children, with the most straightforwardly sympathetic premise imaginable, was buried.
Everyone was told, from Rupert Murdoch, from Fox, to every studio, look, if you touch this thing, you will be out, you will be done. You'll be finished in 3 years.
Every major studio, every major network, not asked, told, stay away from a film about saving children from trafficking. Let the scale of that coordination settle for a moment. The number of people across the number of competing organizations at the number of different levels who had to receive that instruction and comply with it completely. That does not happen because one executive has a personal grudge. That is an industry-wide response generated by people who sit at the very top of the cultural infrastructure. Sound of Freedom was picked up by Angel Studios. When it finally reached theaters, regular Americans, not studios, not critics, not the media apparatus that had tried to make it disappear, made it a phenomenon. Over $200 million at the box office. Audiences buying out entire screenings and paying for strangers to attend. And then something happened at a screening that Caviezel says changed his understanding of exactly what he was up against. At a specific moment in the film, the audience responded. Not prompted, not cued. Spontaneously, they called out the name of an island multiple times. And for a man who had already spent years studying how these networks operate, that moment was not a shock. It was a confirmation.
It's an 8-armed octopus. And if you take just out, that arm will grow back. You have to take the head.
The Hollywood arm that preyed on child actors, the political arm, the financial arm, the island arm, and the one Caviezel keeps returning to, the one that makes all the others sustainable, the media arm. The structure that controls which stories reach you, which names appear in headlines, which scandals get buried before they ever reach your screen. Cut one arm, and the body keeps functioning. The clients do not disappear. The access does not evaporate. The leverage does not dissolve. Someone else absorbs the function. Someone else fills the vacancy. To destroy the network, you do not target the arms. You take the head. Here is what makes the convergence of Caviezel and Feldman's accounts significant beyond what either of them says individually. They are describing the same structure from two completely different entry points. Feldman describes the network from inside it, from inside the rooms, from inside the industry gatherings where the predators circulated freely, arms linked with the exact people who were supposed to be protecting the children around them.
He was surrounded by them. They were everywhere like
Caviezel describes it from the structural level, from the outside architecture, from the pattern of how these operations are built, how access is manufactured, how the cultural machinery of protection actually functions at the top. And the federally documented island operation sits at the intersection of both accounts like a fixed coordinate on a map. The same cultural validators who provided cover to the individuals whose names appear in those flight logs. The same media infrastructure that decided which stories reach the public and which ones ones evaporated quietly. The same organized silence that followed every attempt at exposure. When Caviezel encountered the full scope of what Feldman's documentary had documented, not just the individual names, but the system beneath them, the engineered architecture of mutual protection, he understood something. And the understanding was not intellectual. It was visceral, because Feldman wasn't describing a few predators who happened to share connections. He was describing the same octopus Caviezel had been mapping for years, from a vantage point Caviezel never had, from inside it. Now we get to the name that sits at the center of what Caviezel calls the media arm, the cultural arm, the arm that did not simply remain silent, but actively determined what you were permitted to know. Before we go further, something needs to be established clearly because it matters legally and it matters ethically. Appearing in documents is not guilt. Proximity to men who were later convicted of crimes is not by itself criminal conduct. We are not making those accusations. What we are doing is precisely what Caviezel does. We are identifying a pattern, and patterns that repeat consistently across years and across completely separate cases stop being coincidence and become something that demands a serious answer. The name is Oprah Winfrey. Here is what the documented record shows. Her name surfaces in Epstein-related files on multiple occasions. Her former business partner, the woman she co-founded Oxygen Media with, appears in Epstein's private flight records. That is confirmed. That is in the documents. Harvey Weinstein. For decades, she appeared at his side at industry events. She introduced him to young women with a credibility and a warmth that no amount of money could purchase independently. Her proximity transferred directly onto him. Her endorsement converted him into something that young women, who might otherwise have been cautious, would feel comfortable trusting.
Oprah Winfrey there with him, who entered the room and was swinging off his arm and just seemed like a very dear friend. And these, like Oprah, Naomi, Rita, and Georgina, they all sat at his table. And for me, meeting Oprah was like, oh my God.
Understand what is being described there. Her image, her decades-long positioning as America's moral compass. Her brand was functioning as a trust mechanism, a tool that lowered the defenses of people who never would have trusted Weinstein on his own. Her presence in those rooms made predators appear legitimate. That is the gatekeeper function. Then there was John of God, a Brazilian faith healer she promoted to an audience of tens of millions on her platform. She validated him to her most loyal viewers. He was later convicted of serially assaulting dozens of women. Her response was that she was saddened. The photos of her promoting him exist. The timeline is documented. But the element of the documented record that is hardest to look away from is not a public appearance or a celebrity friendship. It is the school. In 2007, following meetings with Nelson Mandela, Oprah Winfrey opened the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy for girls in South Africa. A $40 million campus, 28 buildings, private uniforms, private meals, a beauty salon, a yoga studio, 2 performance theaters. Girls pulled from poverty across the country and brought to a facility that Oprah called their home. She called herself their mama bear.
Place of learning as well as living for them. We have to have a theater because this is a school for leaders, and in order to be a leader, you have to have a voice.
Within months of the school opening, a dormitory employee named Virginia Makopa was arrested on charges including assault, indecent assault, and soliciting underage girls to perform indecent acts. At least 7 victims came forward. 7 girls taken from impoverished communities, given what was presented to them as the opportunity of their lives, and found themselves being victimized inside the compound Oprah had built specifically for their protection. Oprah flew to South Africa. She said she was shaken to her core. She called herself Mama Bear. And then the story moved in a direction that almost nobody has followed. After the initial response, the staff dismissals, the internal lockdown, parents began describing the school not as a place of recovery and safety but as something closer to a detention facility. 2-hour supervised visits, restricted diets, no outside contact, girls from impoverished communities, girls already isolated by circumstance, now cut off from family, monitored in every dimension of their daily lives, inside a compound controlled entirely by Oprah's organization. The trial then collapsed. Virginia Makopa, charged with 14 counts of indecent acts against children, was acquitted. 9 girls stood up. Not one of them received justice. And then came the reports that mainstream outlets have consistently declined to investigate. An unknown number of girls from the academy, an institution Oprah controlled, funded and publicly championed, cannot be accounted for. No records, no official inquiries, no investigation launched by a woman with billions of dollars, a global media infrastructure, and the resources to find them if she chose to look. She went silent. Jim Caviezel, a man who has spent years studying the procurement patterns, the selection criteria, the operational structure of trafficking networks, looked at that silence and connected it to everything else he had been tracking. He said that publicly, in camera, not as a metaphor, as a statement of belief from someone a decade inside this fight. Caviezel has a specific word for what he believes Oprah Winfrey represents within the architecture of these networks. Not a predator, a gatekeeper. In the context of how these networks actually function, that word carries a precise operational meaning. A gatekeeper is not the individual who commits the act. A gatekeeper is the individual who controls access, who determines who enters and who does not, who constructs the trust infrastructure that makes the entire operation possible, who makes predators appear safe to the people who would otherwise recognize the danger and leave. Consider what that function looks like at Oprah's specific level of cultural authority. She determined which books became bestsellers, which medical figures became household names, which political candidates received the cultural endorsement that financial contributions alone cannot manufacture. She has been publicly credited with materially influencing a presidential election. She decided who was trustworthy in the eyes of tens of millions of Americans. That is not just influence, that is an infrastructure. And then ask yourself the question Caviezel keeps asking in public, at conferences, in interviews that get millions of views. Why would anyone with nothing to hide work to delay and suppress a film about rescuing trapped children?
Why are they so opposed, so frantic in antagonizing Sound of Freedom?
Let's bring everything together. Corey Feldman spent 30 years and $1.3 million of his own money trying to make the world hear what he witnessed as an 11-year-old being handed to a network of connected adult men. He named names in a sealed police report that was never seriously pursued. He named them again on camera to the world. The industry's response was silence. His documentary was interrupted at the 15-minute mark on the night it was supposed to finally be heard. And then the names he named began appearing in completely separate, independently conducted investigations. Same individuals, different decades, different victims, same network. Jim Caviezel watched a film he made about saving children get suppressed by every major studio in the country simultaneously. He watched it become a $200 million cultural phenomenon anyway because regular Americans refused to let it disappear. He has been naming the structure, the octopus, the 8 arms, the head, at every public opportunity since. The documented record shows an island operation federally confirmed and legally established, a school where girls were victimized and others have gone unaccounted for, document appearances connecting powerful cultural figures to a network the world already knows existed, an industry-wide suppression campaign against a film about rescuing children, and a media infrastructure that covered every other major scandal of the last decade with full resources, and went completely silent on this one. Protect the industry, not the children. That instruction was not issued once. It is the operating principle that governed every response to every attempt at exposure for 30 years. When someone is falsely accused of something this serious, they fight back. They pursue legal remedies aggressively and publicly. The silence from the figures at the center of these documented patterns is not nothing. Silence in this context is a data point.
Are we going to let our children go? And that's a question. And people.
That question is not rhetorical. For Caviezel, it is the entire purpose of everything he has done since he watched traffickers offer children to his film crew in broad daylight. For Feldman, it has been the entire purpose of 30 years of being laughed off stages and out of newsrooms. For the 9 girls who stood up at that trial and received no justice. For the ones whose names we do not have because the person with the resources to find them chose silence instead. The octopus is still moving. The arms are still functioning. And the 2 men who have been pointing at the head from opposite ends of the same structure are still talking. So here is what I need from you. Drop it in the comments. Do you believe the documented patterns here rise to the level that demands an official investigation? Do you think Feldman will ever get the justice the system has denied him for 30 years? And do you believe the figures at the center of these allegations will ever face real accountability? If this is the kind of content you came here for, documented, sourced, and asking the questions nobody else will, will. Hit subscribe. This story is not over. The files are still being released. The names are still surfacing. And the silence from the people who should be answering these questions is getting louder by the day.